Before CGI, before blockbusters with $100 million budgets, there was a film that almost never happened. A movie shot in 29 days on a set built over a parking lot, starring an underage actress who lied about her age and an Australian pretending to be British. The time machine wasn't supposed to work. MGM wanted established stars. The effects team made lava from breakfast food. The sequel got killed so many times that the director died still trying to make it. But somehow, this chaotic production created the visual language for every time travel movie that followed. From giant crabs that never made the cut to Woody Woodpecker hidden in plain sight, these are 20 insane facts about George Pal's The Time Machine that prove sometimes the best movies are made by breaking every rule in Hollywood. Number 1. Yvette Mimieux was illegally young and couldn't act. Here's something MGM definitely didn't want you to know. When filming started in May 1959, Yvette Mimieux was only 17 years old. She lied to George Pal, claiming she was 18, and somehow MGM's legal department missed it entirely. California child labor laws were strict about minors working full schedules, but Mimieux worked 12-hour days anyway, technically breaking the law with every single take. The bigger problem? She'd never acted before. Not in films, not on stage, nowhere. Rod Taylor later described his shock when he met his co-star. He called her a strange hippie child and admitted he was terrified to work with her because she literally didn't know how to act. During her screen test, George Pal saw something he called an innocent persona, but innocence doesn't equal talent. Taylor's first choice had been Shirley Knight, an actual actress, but Pal insisted on Mimieux despite MGM initially rejecting her. The situation got so bad that by the end of the 29-day shoot, Mimieux had improved just enough that Pal made a drastic decision. He went back and reshot most of her early scenes. Think about that. On a film with no time and no money, they spent precious days redoing work because their lead actress learned how to act during production. The dreamy, ethereal quality that made Weena so memorable? That wasn't acting. That was Mimieux being genuinely confused about what she was supposed to be doing. Number 2. They built the future on a parking lot walk into the Great Hall where the Eloi feast and looked closely at the floor. See those perfect white lines running parallel and perpendicular across the ground? Those aren't futuristic design elements. Those are parking space markings, because the entire set was constructed directly on top of an MGM studio parking lot, and nobody bothered to put down floor covering. A special effects veteran who worked on the film finally revealed this embarrassing secret decades later. The production was so rushed and underfunded that when they needed to build the Eloy's dining hall, they just erected walls on the asphalt and started filming. The tables and benches were arranged to try to hide the lines, but they're visible in multiple shots. Every time George walks through that ancient hall of the future, he's literally walking across parking space 47 or whatever. The crew knew. The director knew. Everyone just agreed to ignore it and hope audiences wouldn't notice. This is the same film that won an Oscar for special effects, and they couldn't spare $50 for a carpet. It perfectly captures the insane contradiction of this production. Groundbreaking visual effects existing alongside amateur hour mistakes that would get you fired from a student film. Number 3. Rod Taylor was the backup plan. Nobody wanted. George Pal's vision for the time traveler was sophisticated British elegance. He spent months pursuing David Niven, then tried for James Mason. When those fell through, he considered Paul Scofield and Michael Rennie. Notice a pattern? British, middle-aged, distinguished. So who did he end up with? Rod Taylor, a 29-year-old Australian who'd never carried a film before. This was Taylor's first leading role in a feature film, and he got it essentially by default. MGM needed someone cheap, young enough for action scenes, and available immediately. Taylor had been doing supporting roles and was eager for a break. He spent the entire production faking a British accent that occasionally slipped into pure Sydney, especially when he got excited during action sequences. The irony is that Taylor became so identified with the role that in a 1986 interview, he admitted he'd been asked more questions about the time machine than every other film in his career combined. The actor nobody wanted became the definitive time traveler. When they finally shot sequel footage in 1993, 33 years later, Taylor still had the original smoking jacket from the film. He'd kept it in his closet for 3 decades, somehow knowing he'd need it again. Number 4. The giant crab scene that haunted George Pal. The most expensive sequence George Pal ever planned for the time machine never made it to screen. In H.G. Wells's novel, the time traveler goes millions of years into the future after leaving the Eloi and encounters a dying Earth populated by giant crab-like creatures under a bloated red sun. Pal was obsessed with filming this scene. He had concept art drawn, miniatures built, and even started planning the effects. The sequence would have shown monstrous crabs pursuing Rod Taylor across a desolate beach where the ocean no longer moved and the sun hung enormous and red in a twilight sky. The budget to create convincing giant crustaceans in 1960 would have exceeded the entire film's production cost. MGM killed it immediately, but Pal never gave up on those crabs. In a 1975 interview, he described his vision in detail, imagining Taylor and Mimieux alone in this dead world, and how he could have developed a very interesting story of the loneliness of these two people. When he pitched the sequel in 1961, the crabs were there. When he wrote his novel Time Machine 2, in the 1970s, the crabs were major antagonists. He died in 1980, still trying to get those crabs on film. 44 years of fighting for giant crabs that audiences never saw. Number 5. The lava was literally breakfast gone wrong. When London gets destroyed by volcanic eruption, that flowing lava looks terrifyingly real. The secret? It's oatmeal. Cooked oatmeal mixed with red and orange food coloring, liquid detergent for texture, and powdered clay to make it stretch. The effects team cooked massive batches of this nightmare porridge and poured it over miniature sets while the cameras rolled. But here's the disgusting part nobody talks about. Under the hot studio lights, the oatmeal mixture began to ferment. It developed a sour, rotting smell that made the crew gag. By day 2 of filming the destruction sequence, the lava was actively decomposing, releasing actual steam and gas bubbles that accidentally made it look even more realistic. The cinematographer Paul Vogel had to work in short bursts because the smell was so overwhelming. One crew member described it as a burned breakfast buffet crossed with a garbage dump. They had to shoot fast because the mixture would spoil completely within hours. When you watch civilization collapse in that scene, you're watching talented professionals trying not to vomit while gallons of rotten breakfast food ooze through a miniature London. The Academy Award for Special Effects, partially won by oatmeal that had gone bad. Number 6. Woody Woodpecker is hidden. Throughout the movie, George Pal had a secret obsession that appeared in every film he made after 1950. His friend Walter Lantz, creator of Woody Woodpecker, had done cut-rate animation work for Pal's Destination Moon, and Pal decided to hide Woody references in all his subsequent films as tribute. The Time Machine has at least 3, and they're not subtle if you know where to look. During the Eloi celebration scenes, listen carefully to the background. That distinctive ha-ha-ha-ha-ha laugh is mixed into the crowd noise. When the air raid siren sounds in 1966 and people run for shelters, watch the little girl who drops something in the street. She bends down and picks up a Woody Woodpecker doll, visible for about 2 seconds. There's even speculation that some of the Morlocks sound effects include Woody's pecking sound, slowed down and distorted. Why did Pal do this? Nobody knows. He never explained it publicly, just kept inserting an animated woodpecker into serious science fiction films. It became such a trademark that fans would write to him identifying the Woody moments they'd found, like a bizarre scavenger hunt that lasted his entire career. Number 7. The Growing Tree was actually a painting marathon. One of the most mesmerizing effects shows a tree growing, blooming, bearing fruit, and dying in seconds as time accelerates. No trick photography, no animation, no double exposure. The entire sequence was created by artist Bill Brace, literally painting the progression of growth on canvas, one frame at a time. Brace sat at an easel for weeks with a locked-off camera pointed at his canvas. He'd paint the tree slightly more grown. The camera would photograph one frame, then he'd paint more growth, another frame, over and over. Thousands of individual paintings for a sequence that lasts maybe 15 seconds on screen. Each apple had to be painted dozens of times at slightly different sizes. Every leaf required multiple stages of growth and decay. The technique was so painstaking that Brace developed severe hand cramps and had to work in shifts. When George Pal asked why he didn't just use time-lapse photography of a real tree, the effects team explained it would take years to get the shots they needed. Painting it frame by frame was actually faster. Today, this would be done with CGI in an afternoon. In 1960, it required an artist to basically paint an entire tree's life cycle in sequential still frames, a feat of endurance that nobody would even attempt today. Number 8. The Morlocks were torture chambers. Those terrifying Morlocks that haunted children's nightmares? The actors inside them were living their own nightmare. Hua Chung, who later designed creatures for Star Trek, built the masks from latex, fiberglass, and foam rubber with electrical components for the glowing eyes. In 1960, this meant heavy, non-breathable materials that turned into portable saunas under the lights. The masks were so thick the actors couldn't see. They navigated by listening to George Pal shout directions. The latex trapped heat so efficiently that stuntmen were fainting after 2 hours. The production scheduled regular Morlock breaks, where assistants would rush in with fans and ice water. The fluorescent paint used on the faces reacted with sweat to create an unplanned effect. The Morlocks literally glowed more intensely the more the actors perspired. 12-hour shooting days meant some stuntmen spent entire shifts blind, overheating and unable to eat because the masks couldn't be removed quickly. The weird jerky movements that made the Morlocks so unsettling, half of that was intentional choreography. The other half was actors stumbling around because they couldn't see where they were going and were on the edge of heat exhaustion. Number 9. The Time Machine came from a barber's chair. Every design element of that iconic time machine started with MGM art director Bill Ferrari staring at an antique barber's chair he'd found in a prop warehouse. The red velvet seat, the brass controls, the entire sled concept all evolved from that chair. Ferrari thought the Victorian barber chair perfectly captured the era's aesthetic. Ornate but functional, mechanical but elegant, the massive spinning disc behind the seat, inspired by Ferrari's record player at home. He literally looked at his turntable and thought, what if it was 7 feet tall and spun behind the traveler? The brass control panel was hammered together from parts scavenged from old ship equipment and Victorian cash registers. The blinking lights that seemed so futuristic. Those were Christmas lights bought from a surplus store, with electricians hiding beneath the platform, manually switching them on and off in sequence. The prop was so heavy, it required 6 men to move it. The motor that spun the disc was a repurposed washing machine engine that made so much noise they had to dub all the dialogue in post-production. When smoke effects were needed, they used cigarette smokers hidden under the platform because the smoke machines kept breaking. This masterpiece of design that influenced decades of sci-fi was basically a barber's chair attached to a giant record player powered by a washing machine. Number 10. 29 days and under $1 million. In 1960, most Hollywood films took 3 to 6 months to shoot. The Time Machine had 29 days. Total. George Pal scheduled production, like a military operation, storyboarding every shot, pre-planning every camera angle, rehearsing actors during lunch breaks. If a scene needed 2 hours to set up, they shot something else while the crew worked. No downtime, no waste, no second chances. The budget was equally insane, under $1 million for what looked like an epic. Pal achieved this through guerrilla filmmaking. The Victorian London street was recycled sets from other MGM period films, repainted overnight. The Eloy Dome had no ceiling because they couldn't afford lighting, so they shot using natural sunlight and prayed for good weather. The library where books crumble to dust? That was a corner of the studio commissary dressed with fake shelves. MGM's accountants later calculated the film made a profit of exactly $245,000, one of the smallest margins in studio history for a major release. The film that would influence science fiction for generations barely broke even. Pal later said if they'd had one more week and another $100,000, they could have included the giant crabs and the far future sequences. Instead, they created a masterpiece on a budget that wouldn't cover catering for a modern Marvel film. Number 11. The Morlock screams were barnyard nightmare fuel. That bone-chilling sound the Morlocks make, it's not human. Sound designer Franklin Milton recorded donkeys braying, then played the audio backwards. He mixed this with human laughter reversed and slowed to half speed. The bass layer was actual human screams, pitched down until they sounded inhuman. The final mix created a sound that had never existed before in cinema. The technique was so disturbing that several sound engineers refused to work on it, claiming it gave them nightmares. Milton spent weeks in the sound lab layering these elements until he achieved what he called organic terror. The donkey brays provided the harsh metallic quality. The reverse laughter added an unsettling undertone that your brain recognizes as wrong without understanding why. The slowed screams gave it mass and menace. Test audiences had physical reactions to the sound. Some covered their ears. Others reported feeling nauseous. One screening had to be stopped because a child became hysterical. George Pal considered toning it down but decided the extreme reaction meant it was perfect. No film had ever used this combination of reversed animal and human sounds before. The technique became a horror standard, copied in hundreds of creature features since. Number 12. MGM killed the sequel over and over. The moment The Time Machine succeeded, MGM announced Return of the Time Traveler for 1961. George Pal had the story ready. George and Weena would travel to different eras, including ancient Atlantis, featuring battles with giant creatures and paradoxes that threatened existence itself. Rod Taylor and Yvette Mimieux were signed. The script was written. Then MGM's management changed, and the new executives killed it. Pal tried again in 1963, dead. 1967, dead. 1971, dead. Each time, he'd update the script, adding contemporary elements. The 1971 version would have addressed Vietnam and social upheaval. By 1975, desperate to see any version made, Pal wrote it as a novel called Time Machine 2, featuring the time traveler's son building his own machine. Still, no studio would touch it. The most heartbreaking attempt came in 1979. Pal had finally secured funding and was weeks from starting production when he suffered a heart attack. He recovered, but was deemed uninsurable by the studio. The project died again. Pal passed away in 1980, having spent 20 years trying to make a sequel. In 1993, 13 years after his death, they finally shot a 13-minute sequel scene for a documentary with the surviving cast members. It was all George Pal ever wanted, and he never lived to see it. Number 13. Rod Taylor got more questions about this than everything else combined in a 1986 interview. 26 years after The Time Machine, Rod Taylor made a stunning admission. Despite appearing in The Birds, working with Hitchcock, starring in dozens of films and TV shows, he received more fan mail and questions about The Time Machine than his entire other body of work combined. Convention appearances, interviews, casual encounters, everyone wanted to talk about The Time Machine. Taylor kept every piece of Time Machine memorabilia he could. The smoking jacket, photos, scripts, even call sheets. When preparing for the 1993 documentary sequel scene, he pulled out the original costume and it still fit perfectly. He'd been unconsciously maintaining the same weight for 33 years. He knew the entire script by heart, could recall specific shooting days, remembered the names of crew members who'd worked single shifts. The role defined him in ways he never expected. Directors would reference his time traveler performance when explaining what they wanted. Casting agents described him as the time machine guy, decades later. He once said the machine itself became like a family member he'd visit whenever it appeared at exhibitions. When the restored prop was displayed in Los Angeles in 1976, Taylor drove 2 hours to see it, then sat alone with it for an hour, just remembering. Number 14. The original machine was literally thrown away. After filming wrapped in 1960, MGM stored the time machine prop in a warehouse. By 1965, nobody remembered what it was. A cleaning crew partially dismantled it thinking it was junk. The brass control panel ended up in a scrap metal bin. The disc was found leaning against a dumpster. The seat cushion was being used by security guards as a break room chair. In 1970, a collector named Bob Burns started hunting for the machine. He found pieces scattered across 3 different storage facilities. The main body was under a tarp, covered in bird droppings. The control levers were in a box marked brass fixtures. Miscellaneous. The famous disc was bent, scratched, and missing chunks of metal. Burns spent 5 years tracking down components, finding some in prop rental houses, others in private collections, one crucial piece in a janitor's garage. The restoration took 2 years. Every brass piece was hand-polished to match 1960 photographs. The disc was hammered back into shape. Electronic components were rebuilt using vintage parts. When George Pal saw the restored machine in 1976, he cried. The prop that created an entire genre of cinema had been hours from destruction, saved only because one obsessed fan refused to let it disappear. It later sold at auction for over $100,000, but for years, pieces of this masterpiece were literally in the trash. Number 15. They added nuclear war. Because of the Cold War, H.G. Wells never wrote about atomic destruction. His time traveler never witnessed nuclear holocaust. But in 1960, with the Cuban Missile Crisis 2 years away and children practicing duck and cover drills, George Pal knew audiences needed to see their real fear on screen. The sequence where George stops in 1966 and watches civilization destroy itself was pure Cold War paranoia made visual. The air raid sirens they used were actual civil defense recordings. The mushroom cloud was footage from real atomic tests, licensed from the military. When George sees people running to fallout shelters, those extras were told to imagine their own families under nuclear attack. Several actors later admitted the scene was genuinely traumatic to film because it felt too plausible. The volcanic eruption that follows the atomic blast was Pal's invention, suggesting nuclear war could trigger natural disasters. This wasn't scientifically accurate, but audiences didn't care. They saw their deepest terror visualized. Humanity's genius for creation turned to annihilation. The Time Machine became one of the first mainstream films to seriously depict nuclear war's aftermath. It preceded Dr. Strangelove by 4 years, Failsafe by 4 years. This wasn't just science fiction anymore. It was prophecy everyone prayed would stay fictional. Number 16. The time-lapse effects changed cinema forever. The sequence showing centuries passing in seconds required techniques that didn't exist, so the team invented them. Paul Vogel built 7-foot diameter discs divided into 4 colored segments: clear for day, pink for dawn, amber for dusk, blue for night. Electricians hand-cranked these discs in front of lights to simulate days flying by. The precision required was inhuman. One person turning too fast or slow ruined the shot. The famous mannequin in the window changing fashions? They shot one frame, changed the outfit slightly, shot another frame, for weeks. The flowers blooming and dying used milk poured through water tanks filmed in reverse, then composited with time-lapse photography. The clouds racing across the sky were created using a technique so complex that the explanation took up 12 pages in the American Cinematographer's Manual. Every major time travel film since has borrowed from these techniques. The DeLorean's spinning circles in Back to the Future directly reference the time machine's disc. The acceleration effects in dozens of films use variations of Vogel's color disc technique. The Academy Award wasn't just for good effects. It was for inventing an entire visual language for temporal movement that became the standard everyone still follows. Modern CGI time travel sequences still use the same basic visual concepts Vogel created with milk, colored gels, and desperate manual labor. Number 17. Alan Young. Connected 3 generations. Alan Young played David Philby and his son James, but that's the least interesting thing about him. While filming, he was already the voice of Mr. Ed on television. In the 1980s, he became the definitive voice of Scrooge McDuck in DuckTales. When The Time Machine was remade in 2002, Young appeared again, the only actor to bridge both films. Then in 1993, at age 74, he returned for the documentary sequel scene. Young kept meticulous diaries during the original production. His notes revealed that Yvette Mimieux cried after most takes in her first week, that Rod Taylor accidentally knocked himself unconscious with the machine's control lever during a take they kept in the film, that George Pal would sometimes operate cameras himself because they couldn't afford enough operators. These diaries, published decades later, provided the only detailed record of the chaotic production. But here's the beautiful part. When Young recorded his final DuckTales episode in 2016, just months before his death at 96, he told interviewers his 3 greatest roles were Philby, Mr. Ed, and Scrooge. The Time Machine, he said, taught him that science fiction could be profound. A film shot in 29 days on a parking lot influenced his entire approach to character work for the next 56 years. Number 18. The talking rings were record players. Those haunting talking rings that reveal humanity's history. They're literally record players hidden under resin sculptures. The props department built hollow rings from casting resin mixed with metallic powder, then placed tiny turntables underneath the museum table. When the rings spin on the table, they activated the hidden players through magnetic switches. The voice you hear was never credited. George Pal hired a local radio announcer, paid him $50 cash, and told him to sound dead inside. The actor recorded for 3 hours, delivering the same lines with decreasing emotion until Pal got the completely flat, emotionless tone he wanted. The announcer was reportedly so disturbed by the experience he asked not to be credited, claiming the recording session gave him nightmares about losing his humanity. The effect was so convincing that several museums wrote to MGM asking where they could purchase the talking ring technology for their exhibitions. The props department had to send letters explaining it was just hidden record players and a depressed radio announcer. One museum in Boston actually built their own version, using the film as a guide, creating an exhibition about future archaeology that ran for 3 years. The talking rings remain one of the most copied props in science fiction, appearing in various forms in dozens of films since. Number 19. It inspired everything. Walk through any science fiction museum and you'll see the time machine's DNA everywhere. The circular time display of the TARDIS in Doctor Who, created 3 years later, directly homages the machine's spinning disk. Back to the Future's DeLorean has the same circular motifs and lighting patterns. The Terminator's time displacement equipment uses the same basic visual concept of circular energy. Even Bill and Ted's phone booth has a spinning element on top. George Lucas admitted studying the time machine's effects for Star Wars. Steven Spielberg screened it for his effects team before making Close Encounters. James Cameron called it the template for temporal cinematography. The film established rules that nobody questions. Time travel involves circular motion, changing light patterns indicate temporal movement. The traveler remains still while time moves around them. Carl Sagan loved the film so much he piloted the actual prop in his Cosmos series, using it to explain theoretical time travel. The Simpsons parodied it. Futurama referenced it. The visual language George Pal created in 29 days became so fundamental that audiences feel something is wrong when films don't follow these conventions. Modern movies with $100 million budgets still use principles established by a washing machine motor spinning a wooden disc. Number 20. The 3 books. Question still haunts us. The film ends with one of cinema's great unanswered questions. Which 3 books would you take to rebuild civilization? George says 3 books are missing from his library, but we never learn which ones. David Duncan, the screenwriter, later said he never decided because any answer would disappoint someone. George Pal had his own list but never revealed it publicly. Rod Taylor said he imagined they were books about agriculture, medicine, and democracy, but that was just his interpretation. The question became a cultural phenomenon. Libraries hosted 3 books discussions. Universities assigned essays about it. Science fiction conventions held panels debating the optimal choices. The question appears on job interviews, dating profiles, psychological assessments. It became shorthand for asking what knowledge matters most to humanity. Philosophy professors use it to teach value systems. The Library of Congress created an exhibition around it. What makes this brilliant is that it's unsolvable. 3 books can't rebuild civilization, but the question forces you to try. It makes you consider what knowledge is essential versus what's luxury. Do you take practical manuals or preserve literature? Science or philosophy? History or poetry? The film never answers because the question itself is the point. 64 years later, people still argue about those 3 books. George Pal created an eternal debate with a throwaway line that took 5 seconds of screen time. The time machine wasn't supposed to succeed. Every rule of filmmaking said it should have failed. An underage actress who couldn't act. A parking lot pretending to be the future. Breakfast food destroying London. A director obsessed with crabs that never appeared. 29 days and pocket change to create an epic. The sequel that died with its creator. By every logical measure, this should have been a forgotten B-movie. Instead, it became immortal. It created the visual language of time travel. It influenced every science fiction film that followed. It asked questions we're still trying to answer. George Pal proved that limitations force creativity, that imagination matters more than money, that sometimes the most profound art comes from the most chaotic productions. Which fact shocked you most? Was it Mimieux lying about her age? The parking lot set? The oatmeal lava that went rotten? Those giant crabs George Pal spent 20 years trying to film? Or maybe it's knowing that somewhere in a collector's vault sits a brass plate reading, "Manufactured by H. George Wells," a joke hidden on a machine that was literally pulled from a dumpster before becoming priceless. Drop your thoughts below. Share which 3 books you'd take to rebuild the future. And hit that subscribe button, because the strangest stories from classic cinema's forgotten corners are just beginning. Next time, we're diving into a film where the entire cast nearly died. The script was written on napkins, and the monster was played by a man who couldn't swim. Sometimes the most impossible productions create the most unforgettable movies. The Time Machine proved that with 29 days, no money, and enough imagination, you can literally change the future of cinema.